Every tool I own has lived outside for 11 years. Not stored under a tarp, not brought in at the end of the season. Outside, through wet winters, through frost, through the kind of sustained damp that should have reduced them to orange powder by now. None of them have rusted. And I have not spent a single dollar on any rust prevention product in over a decade, because 11 years ago I found out what the active ingredient in every bottle on the hardware store shelf actually is. It is a $3 powder that has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years. The $30 bottle with the branded label is the same chemistry. Different container, substantially larger profit margin. Here is what happens when you drop a rusted chisel into a bucket of strong black tea and leave it for 3 days. You pull it out, and the surface has changed. The loose, flaking orange rust that was eating into the metal is gone, and in its place is a dark blue-black coating sitting directly on the steel. It does not wipe off. It is not paint or sealant or anything applied from outside. What you are looking at is the rust itself, chemically converted into something that now protects the metal instead of destroying it. The same material that was the problem has become the solution. That is not a trick or an oversimplification. It is a straightforward chemical reaction that has been understood and documented for centuries, costs almost nothing to carry out, and produces a result that bonds to the steel at a molecular level rather than sitting loosely on the surface waiting for the first wet season to lift it away. Before getting into the method, it is worth understanding how old this knowledge is and how it was discovered, because that history tells you something important about why it works and why most people have never heard of it in this form. Roman leather workers were among the earliest documented users of this reaction, though they stumbled onto it through a completely different trade. The process of turning animal hides into leather involved soaking them in water with oak bark, which is dense with compounds called tannins. The tannins would react with any iron present in the tanning water, leaving a dark stain on the metal tools and vessels involved. At some point, someone paid close attention to those stained tools and noticed that the iron came out of the tannin bath darker, and that it held up noticeably better against rust. That observation moved from the leather workshop to the forge. It was not written up as a scientific discovery. It moved the way practical knowledge moves, from one pair of hands to the next, through demonstration and repetition across generations of craftspeople. On the other side of the world, Japanese swordsmiths had arrived at the same place through a completely different route. Their method used the fermented juice of unripe persimmons, a liquid naturally high in tannins, to treat the surface of iron and steel. The result was a dark, stable coating that protected blades against moisture. This had no connection to European practice. It grew from the same underlying observation made entirely independently. Certain plant-derived substances, when brought into contact with iron, produce a color change and appear to strengthen the metal's resistance to corrosion. That observation was refined over centuries into a deliberate and precise technique. Blacksmiths across medieval Europe, West African ironworkers preparing their tools before the rainy season, craftspeople in China and the Middle East working with what their local landscapes offered. All of them arrived at versions of the same conclusion using different plant materials that shared the same chemistry. Oak bark, strong tea, oak galls, grape skins, pomegranate rind, the bark of the shea tree. Different sources, same underlying compound, same reaction, same dark protective result. The fact that this discovery was made independently, by people on multiple continents with no contact between them, is not a coincidence. It is what happens when a chemical reaction is consistent, reliable, and produces a result that is obviously and immediately useful to anyone working with iron. The chemistry was formally documented by a French chemist in the early 19th century who identified and described the reaction between tannins and iron compounds. That documentation gave the process a scientific framework, but it did not invent the practice. It described something people had already been doing for a very long time. The compound the reaction produces, ferric tannate, is now well understood, and the method is still used today by professional conservators at museums and cultural institutions to treat and stabilize corroded iron artifacts. The Canadian Conservation Institute, which advises on the preservation of historical objects intended to last centuries, publishes this process in its standard guidelines. This is not a piece of internet folklore that has avoided scientific scrutiny. It is a documented, peer-reviewed process in active professional use, which raises the obvious question: If the method is this well documented, this inexpensive, and this old, why is it not something most people know about and use? The answer sits in the economics of the hardware store shelf rather than in any property of the chemistry. Walk into any hardware store, and the rust treatment products available run between $15 and $30 a bottle. Read the safety data sheet on any of them, and you will find tannic acid listed as the primary active ingredient. The chemistry inside the branded bottle and the chemistry in a $3 bag of food-grade tannic acid powder are the same. The difference is the packaging, the marketing spend behind the name on the label, and the margin built into the gap between what the raw material costs and what the finished product sells for. Beyond the consumer market, the broader automotive parts industry generates hundreds of billions of dollars annually, a meaningful portion of which flows directly from rust damage requiring component replacement. A widely known, inexpensive method that converts existing rust into a stable protective layer and significantly extends the working life of metal parts does not serve the commercial interests of industries whose revenue depends on those parts degrading and needing replacement. That is not a conspiracy. It is a straightforward description of how incentives work. What happened over the last century is not that this knowledge was disproven or superseded by something more effective. It is that it stopped being transmitted through practice at the same time that packaged alternatives filled the shelves. The chain of knowledge that ran from Roman tanneries to medieval forges to generations of craftspeople maintaining their tools through wet seasons quietly broke. The knowledge did not disappear. It moved into conservation, literature, and academic papers and stayed there, available to anyone who looked for it, no longer part of everyday practice for most people. Understanding why the reaction works starts with understanding what rust actually is. Most people think of rust as something that appears on metal, a surface problem, like dirt, that sits on top and can be removed with enough effort. That framing is not quite right. Rust is iron oxide, a compound that forms when iron reacts with oxygen in the presence of moisture. It is not sitting on the surface of the metal. It is the surface of the metal, chemically altered. The iron atoms in the outer layer have bonded with oxygen and become something structurally different from the steel underneath. This is why wire brushing alone never permanently solves the problem. You can remove the loose, flaking outer layer, but the conversion has already happened deeper, and as long as oxygen and moisture have access to the exposed metal, the process continues. The soul. Tannin reaction works because it does not try to remove the iron oxide. It reacts with it. Tannins are a class of naturally occurring compounds found in a wide range of plants, concentrated particularly in oak bark, oak galls, tea leaves, chestnut wood, and grape skins. They serve a defensive function in plants, making bark and unripe fruit bitter and astringent to discourage animals. The drying, puckering sensation you notice when drinking a strong cup of black tea is tannin binding to proteins in your saliva. That binding behavior is not incidental. It is central to how tannins function, and it is the same mechanism that drives the rust conversion reaction, except that the target is iron rather than protein. When tannin contacts iron oxide, the tannin molecules bind to the iron ions in the rust, producing a new compound, ferric tannate, that is blue-black in color, insoluble in water, and integrated directly into the steel surface at a molecular level. The color change you see on the metal during treatment is not just an indication that something is occurring. It is the conversion process itself, visible in real time, moving across the surface over 10 to 15 minutes, from the orange-brown of iron oxide to the dark, stable tone of ferric tannate. This compound is not new and not obscure. Iron gall ink, the medium used to produce manuscripts, official documents, and artworks across Europe and the Middle East for over 1,000 years, is made by reacting iron with the tannins found in oak galls. Some of those manuscripts are still legible today, the ink still dark and intact after 8 centuries. The chemistry that has held handwritten text stable for 800 years is the same chemistry that forms on the surface of a treated tool. Research has shown that the most effective formulation combines tannic acid with phosphoric acid, specifically around 3% tannic acid and 10% phosphoric acid in solution. The phosphoric acid helps the tannin penetrate more deeply into the rust layer, rather than reacting only at the surface, and converts any remaining iron oxide into ferric phosphate, another stable and protective compound. Phosphoric acid is the active ingredient in a product called navel jelly, sold at most hardware stores for a few dollars, which makes it straightforward to incorporate without handling concentrated acid directly. The materials needed are a bag of food-grade tannic acid powder, available online for $3 to $5 per 100 grams, a small amount of navel jelly, and distilled water. Tap water contains chloride ions that accelerate corrosion rather than inhibiting it, so distilled water is worth the $1 it costs at a grocery store. You will also need a wire brush or steel wool for preparation and a foam brush or cotton cloth for application. Total outlay sits between $3 and $6, depending on what you already have. Preparation is not about getting back to bare metal. This is the point where most people go wrong if they approach this with the instincts of conventional rust treatment. The tannin reaction needs existing rust to work with. Ferric tannate forms when tannin molecules bind to the iron ions in iron oxide. If you remove all the rust and expose clean steel, the conversion cannot happen properly. What the preparation stage removes is the rust that has already detached, the loose and powdery outer layer that would prevent the solution from making good contact with the rust that is still bonded to the metal. Wire brush or steel wool the surface to remove what comes away easily, wipe off any dust or debris, and leave the rest. To mix the solution, dissolve 4 grams of tannic acid powder in 100 milliliters of warm distilled water. The liquid will turn a deep brown, similar to very strong black tea, which confirms the tannin has dissolved correctly. Add a teaspoon of navel jelly and stir until combined. That is the complete formula. Apply it to the prepared surface with the foam brush or cloth, covering the area evenly. Within 10 to 15 minutes, the color change begins. Orange-brown shifts toward dark gray and settles into the blue-black of ferric tannate. Once that conversion color has appeared across the surface, leave it to dry completely, which takes 2 to 4 hours at normal temperature. Do not apply heat to speed the process. Allow it to dry at its own pace. Once the first coat is fully dry, apply a second. The reason for multiple thin coats rather than a single thick application is that ferric tannate forming too quickly at the surface can become brittle and detach. Thin coats, each dried fully before the next is applied, build up a layer that is denser and better adhered to the steel underneath. 2 coats is standard for most applications. For heavily rusted surfaces or anything that will face persistently harsh conditions, a 3rd coat adds meaningful additional protection. Once the final coat has cured, the treated surface needs a top coat suited to its intended use. For hand tools, axes, and knives, boiled linseed oil or beeswax are the traditional and most practical choices. Linseed oil applied thinly with a cloth, left a few minutes, and then wiped back so no excess remains on the surface provides a moisture barrier and is easily reapplied in the field. Beeswax, either melted and brushed on warm or rubbed directly from a solid block and buffed with a cloth, does the same job. For vehicle frames and structural metal components, rubberized undercoating spray applied after the final tannin coat has fully cured provides the flexible, durable barrier appropriate for road exposure and the vibration of regular use. For cast iron cookware, the finishing step is simply reseasoning in an oven at around 180 degrees Celsius with a thin layer of cooking oil, which is the standard maintenance process for cast iron in any condition. One expectation worth addressing directly: the finished surface does not look like paint or a coating has been applied. It looks like metal that has gone darker, with a matte, slightly metallic quality. People sometimes see that and assume the treatment was incomplete or the solution was not concentrated enough. That reaction is understandable and entirely mistaken. The blue-black appearance is precisely what a correctly converted surface looks like. The color is the evidence that the process worked, not a sign that it did not. One honest qualification: this method significantly reduces corrosion and extends the working life of metal when applied correctly and maintained with periodic touch-ups. It does not make metal immune to rust under all conditions. In coastal environments with consistent salt air, or on vehicles driven regularly through road salt, the ferric tannate layer will degrade more quickly than in moderate conditions and will need reapplication more often. For most tools and general metalwork, a once-a-season touch-up using the same solution takes around 20 minutes and keeps the protection effective year after year. The knowledge that tannins convert iron oxide into a stable protective compound was not developed in a laboratory. It was observed independently by people doing practical work on different continents, across different centuries, with no contact between them. The convergence of that discovery across such different contexts is not a curiosity. It is evidence of how consistent and accessible this reaction is. When the right plant-derived material meets iron oxide, the chemistry works. It worked 2,000 years ago in a Roman tannery, and it works today in an afternoon on your driveway. Whatever you are looking at right now, with rust on it, the rust is not a problem requiring a $30 bottle or a specialist product. It is iron oxide. And iron oxide, in the presence of tannin and a little patience, becomes the protection itself.